Mid-20th century education was under the microscope as science became the central focus of curriculum. As many educators and scholars sought justification for the arts and their place in education, they began to focus their attention on a discipline-based arts education. Aesthetics became the focus of philosophical conversation in art education. One man would dedicate his life's work to ensure that aesthetics would take center stage in art education for decades to come. Ralph Alexander Smith was an American cultural and educational policy educator. As a professor emeritus of cultural and educational policy at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, his goal was to establish art and the humanities as a content area in American education. Throughout his career, Smith led a persuasive argument that authentic aesthetic experiences justified the continued inclusion of art education in American schools. The dominant purpose of his teaching was to cultivate an appreciation for the excellence of works of art in student education. Though sometimes criticized for his stance on excellent art, he was highly respected for his contributions as a scholar of art education. This is evidenced by the many accolades he earned for his journalistic and editorial contributions from respected policymakers, philosophers, and art educators. Smith was born on June 12, 1929 in Elwood City, Pennsylvania. He was the third child of Joseph B. Smith and Bertie Smith. Smith attended Beaver Falls High School in Pennsylvania. He then attended Columbia College in New York, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Liberal Arts in 1954. Smith's education was put on hold when he was drafted into military service. He completed basic training and was assigned to Germany. While Smith was in Germany, he met his future wife, Christiana Maria Kolb. Ralph and Christiana were married in Bad Tölz, Bavaria. After his service to the military was complete, Smith and his new wife moved back to the United States, where he promptly returned to college. In 1959, Smith earned a master's degree from Teachers College, Columbia University. He then completed his doctoral degree in fine arts from Teachers College, Columbia University in 1962. Ralph Smith began his professional career as a professor of art history and art education. Smith taught at Kent, Ohio State University, Wisconsin State University, Oshkosh, New York State University, New Paltz, and finally settled at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in 1964. Smith spent most of his years as a professor of cultural and educational policy and aesthetic education at the University of Illinois. A major portion of his professional time was spent working on the Quarterly Journal of Aesthetic Education, published by the University of Illinois Press, which he founded in 1966 and served as its editor for 34 years. Smith would retire from the University of Illinois in 1996 as Professor Emeritus of Educational Policy Studies. After his retirement, Smith continued to be a constant editorial contributor to philosophical journals that focused on the development of art education curriculum. He authored and edited many books, including Aesthetics and Criticism in Art Education, Problems in Defining, Explaining, and Evaluating Art, 1971, The Sense of Art, A Study in Aesthetic Education, 1989, and Aesthetics and Art Education in 1991. As scientific reasoning became an influence on models of education, some theorized that the emphasis in art education should shift away from art as self-expression and move toward a discipline-based model that included art making, criticism, aesthetics, and history. The value of art had begun to edge toward its use as an instrument for both self-reflection and political persuasion. Monroe Beardsley, who wrote Aesthetics, Problems in the Philosophy of Criticism in 1958, shaped Smith's view of art education, which was based on the excellence of aesthetic experience afforded by exemplary works of art. Smith would apply Beardsley's emphasis on beauty and excellence to his theories. He wrote, "I was originally drawn to Beardsley's work because I perceived how his theory of aesthetic value could help correct an imbalance in the theory of art education." Manuel Barkin was another one of the most influential art educators of the 20th century. Barkin earned his M.A. from the Teachers College, Columbia University, during the same period of time of Smith's attendance. Barkin, who was influenced by the work of John Dewey and Jerome Bruner, suggested that visual arts and the humanities could be compared to the process of scientific inquiry in his quest to justify the arts as part of a valuable curriculum. In his 1962 book, Transition into Art Education, Barkin had refuted the shift away from art as a discipline by stating that the focus on educating the whole child has led to the view of art as child's play. Smith was also concerned that this view of the purpose of art was becoming more important than the aesthetic value of art. As justifications for teaching arts began to lean in the direction of these non-aesthetic objectives, there was an increasing unease, even alarm, that the arts and education in the arts were in danger of becoming inauthentic. Smith's view maintained that art should be created and studied to share meanings and experiences to better understand, enjoy, and pass on. Art must be defended and pursued and relished, not for any political program it might be thought to serve, but for what it is, in and of itself, as mode of knowledge, as a source of spiritual and intellectual enlightenment, as a special form of pleasure and moral elevation, according to Smith. By the early 1960s, aesthetic art had officially arrived on the scene and become the topic of scholarly discussion. Smith acknowledged the timing in an essay he wrote when he stated, "References to aesthetic education began to appear more frequently in discussions of arts education around the mid-20th century. President Kennedy had dedicated funding to a committee whose sole purpose was to study education in the arts. Lyndon B. Johnson would take the cue from Kennedy and fund the National Endowment for the Arts in 1965. Art educators who were poised to catch the gust used these tailwinds to propel their philosophies. Influenced by Manuel Barkin, Elliot Eisner, and Vincent Lanier's previous references to aesthetic experiences in art, Ralph Smith would take their concepts further with the founding of the Journal of Aesthetic Education in 1966. His first issues radiated a sense of optimism and confidence about the viability of art education. As concern continued to mount over the perceived decline in the quality of public education in the early 70s and 80s, Smith focused on mitigating the fading rationale to include art education in American schools. He continued to lead a persuasive argument that aesthetics were justification for the inclusion of art as a subject in education. In one of his many essays for the Arts Education Policy Review, Smith quoted art educator Stanley Madeha's explanation that aesthetic education in its simplest sense is learning how to perceive, judge, and value aesthetically what we have come to know through the senses. Smith saw this vision of aesthetics in art as holistic and included visual arts, literature, and performing arts in his essays and discussions. There were those who thought his insistence on the pursuit of high-quality work in creating, responding to, understanding, and judging the arts, no matter the age of the student, was elitist. Some also feared that his emphasis on excellence in aesthetics would overshadow the needs of students as developing critical thinkers. Arthur Eflin explains his concern with Smith's view of aesthetic education in his 1992 essay, Ralph Smith's Concept of Aesthetic Experience and Its Curriculum Implications. Eflin notes 4 difficulties. A. Determining whether students are having quality aesthetic experiences. B. Attention to exemplary works limits opportunities to judge artworks independently. C. A tendency to include problematic works. And D. A tendency to limit study to modern or pre-modern works. He further explained that if Smith's views were implemented, art education would devote itself to the cultivation of worthwhile aesthetic experiences provided by the use of excellent exemplary works. This would create a gap in emphasis on the historical and critical understandings of art that a student would otherwise develop through instruction. In other words, the emphasis would be on the high quality of the art. To effectively assess student progress under this line of thinking, the student would need to have previously acquired quite a bit of artistic vocabulary, advanced concepts, and attitudes in order to communicate their progress through dialogue or writing. Consequently, the authentic assessment of an aesthetic experience in art would be nearly impossible. The other criticism put forth by Eflin is that Smith's aesthetic valuing relies on a teacher-driven experience. Students are asked to appreciate work that the teacher appreciates, and therefore aesthetic approval is made for the learner rather than by the learner. Eflin also objected to the less than universal views Smith had of art. Eflin stated, "I am not claiming that Smith has a faulty conception of art, only that his is not a universal view." While Eflin appreciated Smith's emphasis on high art that carried on throughout his work, he felt Smith's view was modernist and that art education should move on to a more postmodern approach, one that does not exclude politics and commerce. Eflin was concerned that the emphasis on aesthetic valuing would exclude social criticism and thereby limit exposure to contemporary art, which is socially oriented. While Eflin was concerned about these limitations, he appreciated the cognitive view of learning that Smith supported. Throughout his career, Ralph Smith maintained that authentic art education occurs with the designation of the teacher as central authoritarian figure, or expert, who emphasizes the excellent while maintaining focus on the most essential aspects of education. Though Ralph Smith drank from the same watering hole as many of his progressive colleagues, he was diametrically opposed to those who followed progressive philosophies. Victor Lowenfeld, who wrote Creative and Mental Growth in 1947, developed a progressive pedagogy focused on creativity and self-expression. Lowenfeld based his existentialist philosophies on his studies of children's drawings in the 1940s. He encouraged teachers to support students as they self-reflected and expressed themselves. However, Ralph Smith's essentialist pedagogy favored a teacher-led classroom that focused on classical art criticism, history, and aesthetics. His ideology, which emphasized high standards of teaching and learning, were fundamentally conservative. The dominant purpose of his teaching was to cultivate in students an appreciation for the excellence of works of art. This would fit well with Gerald Gutek's explanation of idealism, in which he stated that the quest for excellence is a realistic and guiding force. To follow a noble standard of life is desirable and achievable. However, Ralph's openness to the metaphysical, the influence of beauty, and the emphasis on excellence would also point heavily to the realist philosophy. As a major influence in art education for over 4 decades, Smith left behind a legacy of journalistic contributions, recognition, and influence in art education. His writings were widely recognized in this country as well as abroad and produced an array of awards. Along with Manuel Barkin, Smith's work was a precursor of the intellectual basis for the development of discipline-based art education, or DBAE. In the late 1970s and 80s, Smith's contributions to aesthetic education were referenced by the Central Midwestern Regional Educational Laboratory, or CEMREL. CEMREL, in collaboration with the Getty Institute, led one of the most ambitious movements to reform art education in history when they created discipline-based arts education. DBAE included 4 disciplines: artistic creation, art history, art criticism, and aesthetics. Smith himself acknowledged that his aesthetic philosophies were noted in the DBAE for their usefulness in justifying art education, and also for providing content and suggestions for teaching. Among other recognitions during his lifetime, Ralph Smith received the Manuel Barkin Memorial Award in 1971, National Art Educator Award for Career Achievement in 2000, both from the National Art Education Association. To those who felt his work was based on elitist principles, Ralph Smith's goal was never to make art education inaccessible, but quite the opposite. He made a continuous effort throughout his lifetime to ensure equitable access to high-quality art education by demanding quality content and excellent work from and for all.